All right, yeah.
Tell
Let's
me how, just can we just tell me how this is going to work? You're just going to interview me. It's going to be recorded and then transcribed. Is
Yeah,
that
yeah. It's going to be
yeah?
transcribed into Chinese. It's going to be
Right.
published in the Journal of China Democracy.
Right.
And yeah, I'll give you the English translation. That's what they usually do first. They usually transcribe it into English, and then from English to
Sure.
Chinese, they have software that does that transcribes it from English into Chinese.
Is the format a simple Q&A?
Yeah, I may
Yeah.
ask some follow-up questions, but a
Yeah,
lot
yeah,
of
yeah,
it
yeah. No, but yeah.
a lot of it
Okay.
has to do with your book, democratization, technological development, um,
Yeah,
and
technological
democratization.
development, I may not be too good on. I'm an old geezer, but
Yeah, well,
that's that's fine.
it's just basic, not, it's basic questions that
No,
if
no, no, no. The reason I asked was as opposed to uh I mean, it's a transcribed Q&A rather than a written up interview of,
yeah,
uh
yeah,
yeah.
if there's some questions that you feel that it can be better answered if you take time to write it up, that's fine too.
Okay.
I have no
Good.
problem with that, and that's fine as well. But why don't we get started?
Good.
All right, so one of the central themes in your book is how Western leaders often downplay or ignore China's repressive policies. Can you elaborate on why Western leaders have been so reluctant to confront China's human rights records, particularly in the context of trade and economic relationships?
Well, in fact, my own personal experience in covering China as a newspaper correspondent in the 80s, um, the US and Western countries were downplaying human rights, not primarily for reasons of commercial interest, but for strategic interests. Uh, so at that time, the need for China's help or cooperation uh, in dealing with the Soviet Union was so great that the United States was downplaying human rights for that reason. And it was not, and then it switched in the 90s after the end of the Cold War to uh, a tremendous commercial interest in China as the world's last untapped market. And so, just at the time that the strategic interest in needing China against the Soviet Union had really run out, the commercial interest took off, and there was a new and entirely different but intense constituency for relations with China, such that we needed to that U.S. officials felt they needed to downplay human rights.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. There's strategic interests. Particularly, they served as a counterweight to the Soviet Union by befriending the Chinese, forming an alliance. And then there's a lot of commercial interest now. There's 1.4 billion people in China, and more than 25% constitutes the first world middle class and above. So that's over 300 million people, nearly the size of the United States, that can potentially be consumers. But all right, let's go on to the next question. This has to do more with technology. Given the ongoing tensions between China and the United States, particularly around technology, what do you see the key differences in innovation culture between the two countries? How do they approach global tech leadership?
I'm not an expert on technology. I would say this that on the one hand, the United States has a tremendous advantage based on its educational system in developing new technology and new uses of technology. On the other hand, China has universities that are turning out a tremendous volume of well-educated engineering and science students. So I would look to the United States to continue developing new products, but China is quite capable of developing quite a bit on its own.
Yeah, my understanding has been the Chinese haven't been very innovative. The last Nobel Prize winner has been more than 50 years ago, and a lot of their
Right.
technology, their base of technology, comes from theft of American technology.
Oh,
Um,
for sure, for sure.
and
That was one of the several mistakes in the agreement in under which the United States supported China's admission to the World Trade Organization. That it didn't address the questions of technology theft. It didn't address the serious question of whether companies going into China, setting up in China, would be required
Mhm.
to transfer technology to China.
Yeah, the Americans thought that they always have that advantage because they could innovate. They may supply the Chinese with the not the latest generation of technology, but China would acquire at least maybe a generation behind, or maybe a generation behind or two, and the United States would always be able to innovate and create and surpass the generation that they had given to the Chinese. And the reason they were okay with doing this is because they wanted that large share of market, and there was a stipulation where, from an exchange for market share, they'd have to hand over technology. So yeah, so that's
I
also
mean,
been
I I worked in China at a very early stage in the 80s, and when I think back now to the arrogance of American companies that the Chinese were very primitive and couldn't do X, Y, and Z, the contrast to the reality of today is striking. I mean, I can remember when there was a McDonnell Douglas manufacturer in Shanghai, and they would come back laughing at the incompetence of the Chinese, and they would never fly in a Chinese plane, and so on.
yeah, I can see that. Yeah, the if you look at during the Cultural Revolution and the way they've improvised with creating technology, the technology that they created, no, if you look at the Y-10, the plane that was created in the 1980s, which was a copy of the DC-9, a McDonnell Douglas plane, but it was only able to go in the air for like 30 minutes, and it broke apart in midair, and no Chinese leader would ever want to ride on a Chinese plane because they can't guarantee the safety in its construction. I
Yeah,
remember that.
we should note that even today,
Yeah,
China is relying on Airbus and Boeing rather than becoming a global airplane manufacturer for
yeah,
now.
yeah. They're trying to create the C919, but they're only using 30% of their indigenous technologies, and nearly 70% of the plane is made with foreign technologies. All right, let's continue to move forward. How would you evaluate the effectiveness of U.S. policies towards China? What do you think the U.S. could be doing differently to address China's growing influence without escalating tensions?
Let me ask you on this. Do you mean this is on technology or in general?
In general.
Um, I think that it took the United States far too long to recognize that China was becoming um, a mercantilist country capable of absolutely transforming international trade. It should have recognized that, a good 15 years before it did. It should have recognized the threat of technology theft much earlier than it did. I think that the general direction of policies of the last, let's say, 7 years or so has been in the right direction. I think that, and I do date that to the changes in direction of policy that began in the first Trump administration. But I also think that one of the most important aspects of dealing with China as it is today are very strong relationships and alliances between the United States and its allies in Europe and Asia. So I worry. I think that the Biden administration um, isn't credited enough for all it did to work together with Europe and Japan, South Korea, Australia in dealing with China. I left out India, but that's a more complicated case. Um, and I fear at this moment, with a new administration uh, about to take office, that has a much more negative view of America's allies. I fear that strength may erode.
Yeah. Do you think the Trump administration, the tariffs that is going to place, in some newspaper reports, they said that they were going to tax China up to 60%. Do you think that China has a sluggish economy today, a lot from the real estate market, from the trade war? Do you think if we stop on higher tariffs, that the country will weaken and there'll be more protests against and more fingers pointed at the government that may be able to facilitate change and liberalization of the political system?
I think what you've just given voice to is an optimistic view. I think that well, first of all, let me say that I support higher tariffs against China in particular. Returning to my earlier question, um, I do not support tariffs on Europe and other countries to the same extent. I do think China should be singled out, and the rationale is its impact on international trade and its own restrictive trade practices. Um, yes, I think the impact will be quite strong on China. When I teased that you had an optimistic view, yes, I think that higher tariffs and on China and a sluggish economy um, will produce a reaction in China. But I don't think I think that reaction. First of all, I think that the party's control of the country is such that I don't think we're going to see. Sorry to say, I don't think we're going to see some democratic upsurge. I think that the security apparatus is so strong that it can stop any protest movement uh, that gets moving before it gets very far. Um, so what it would produce is something that I think we've seen already, which is strong reactions within the top levels of the party from those who are involved in the economy and finance. And I would point out, there was a debate about this before. The uh, longtime China hand from Britain, Roger Garside, did a book called China Coup about 2 or 3 years ago, and he predicted before the last Party Congress that the leadership led by some of the economic leaders. I think it was probably Li Keqiang or I can't remember exactly who. Um, were going to overthrow Xi Jinping. And what that left out was the power of the security apparatus. And we sit here in Washington, New York, and some very well educated and very well connected uh, people come from China with ties to the leadership and suggest that there is unhappiness with Xi Jinping. And I'm sure that there is, but people take from that the idea that somehow Xi is going to be overthrown, and I just find that far-fetched.
Mhm. So what do you think has to happen for greater political liberalization or the path towards democratization in China? How do you see how do you see with the current surveillance state, how do you see getting around that or possible dismantling of it or
Um, I don't see anything happening in the next few years. I think it would take a prolonged uh, excuse me, prolonged economic downturn and tremendous public unhappiness that over a process of years um, might cause the people of the country to um, voice their unhappiness, not necessarily in the streets, but in a series of mini protests, uh, uh, refusal to go to work. It's not quite clear to me how it would happen because I'm afraid I'm very pessimistic it would.
No, I understand. I understand. Since the publication of the China Fantasy, have you seen any changes in how Western policymakers or the public view China? Do you think your book had any impact on these views?
Um, I think that, I mean, at the time my book came out, which was 2007, 8, it was widely attacked uh, in the United States by China hands. And it took 10 years, I would say 8 to 10 years, for the book to suddenly, not suddenly, but for people to recognize that the two main arguments of the book were uh, on the money, were correct. The first, that trade and greater wealth and investment in China were not going to lead to a political liberalization. Really, in 2007 and 8, people still believed that. I can remember, um, this goes back a ways, but Mike Oxenberg, very smart China hand, writing that he thought that maybe that the Chinese Communist Party was going to go the way of the Japan's Liberal Democratic Party, that it was going to, in a democratic way, win every election, the way the LDP always won every election. People really did believe that. It was all linked famously to Francis Fukuyama's ideas about the end of history. And it took about 10 years. The other prediction of the book, which gets less attention, but I think was as important, was in a chapter called Who's Integrating Who or Whom. And the belief of the 90s and the aughts was that, particularly through trade and the WTO, but in general, the United States was going to integrate China into the international system. And I raised the point that maybe China would be doing its own integrating and would help um, create the appeal and financial incentives of autocracy to other countries. And that has turned out to be true too. So coming back to your original question, do you want to add, I mean, what was the original question again?
But if there's been any, if your book had any impact on the
Yeah,
public view?
I think I think I think it had zero impact for about 10 years, and then I think it had a lot of impact. And I can't tell you the number of people who served in government and who came back around and said, you were right.
Yeah. So do you think China's, especially during COVID, its its um its relationship to the World Health Organization and other international organizations, you think that's a product of of its economic development and operating within the realm of rule guidance, within a set of rules and with and expectations that the international community has for it, that was acting within the realm of these international organizations, or like the World Health Organization praised China during COVID, when all along the virus, if it came out of a virology lab, started in China.
Mhm. I think China has made a tremendous effort and with quite a bit of success to be represented and if not overrepresented on international bodies, the WHO being one of them. And it does this by um, campaigning with a bunch of pressure on other countries who are members of these organizations, and their rewards as well. We saw this, this showed up on the sports pages with the Olympics. Uh, and I think that was at play uh, with COVID, that the international organization wasn't particularly going on the science, it was going on the politics of China's power.
Yeah, makes sense. And what type of pressure did it place on other members of the organization, having to do with trade and and economics?
You know, uh, to start with, there's pressure on individual members, pressure being sometimes economic rewards, um, sometimes um, uh, pressure on the country, trade pressure on the country involved. Um, I'm not sure what else there is to say on
Yeah.
it.
No, I
Oh,
understand.
wait. Uh, Again, the original question, what was the pressure? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so based on, I
And
know,
the one other thing to add is that there is an intense anti-American uh, campaign by the Chinese with these organizations. So if you go along with the Chinese argument is, if you support the United States, it's because um, you're supporting the hegemon, and you really don't want to do that.
okay. So, when comparing China to other authoritarian regimes, particularly in the 20th century, do you think the Chinese Communist Party is more likely to survive without democratizing? What factors make China's situation unique compared to, say, the Soviet Union or other dictatorships that have undergone transitions? What makes China unique in that sense?
Very good question. And the first and most important answer is that China is economically integrated in the international system in a way that the Soviet Union certainly wasn't. Um, so even with all of um, the sanctions that get put on, the occasional, I mean, the somewhat decoupling that has taken place in the last few years. Nevertheless, um, the United States itself still does huge amounts of trade with China, and that's just the United States. China has, I mean, the German economy became almost dependent upon sales to China. Um, uh, J Japan has huge amounts of trade with China, so it makes it much more difficult um, to deal with a totalitarian China than it was to deal with a totalitarian Soviet Union.
Yeah, so China's integration into the market economy uh, has really played an impact, unlike the Soviet Union. And interesting thing about the Soviet Union, the United States and the Soviet Union were in an arms race. and the Soviet Union couldn't compete, consisting of because of its command economy, and people were starving. There was no food on the shelves, and the Strategic Defense Initiative, initiated by Reagan, really put great fear because it could render the Soviet Union's arsenal impotent, and it was ultimately Gorbachev who introduced perestroika and glasnost, which led to openness and reform in the Soviet Union. You think anything like that could happen in China? You think it can take an individual when there's a lot of disgruntled or a stagnant economy or a poor or a struggling economy, somebody within the government who is going to be sympathetic to the Chinese people, and that would lead to greater liberalization?
In theory, yes. I mean, I do think that if there were some entirely new leader uh, offering a Chinese version of glasnost and perestroika, yes, I think that would have a huge impact. But the follow-up to that is I can't tell you the amount of effort that the Chinese Communist Party has made to making sure will not be another
Yeah,
Gorbachev. There will not be a Chinese Gorbachev. And it's funny on that. Having said that, you have to look over the past 30, 25 years at how China reacted to that. So in the 90s and aughts, how do we prevent another Chinese Gorbachev? The answer was we're going to have a weak leader like meaning Hu Jintao. Um, we're going to have essentially a collective leadership. So there won't be a strong leader who could adopt glasnost or whatever. And then they did a 180 with Xi Jinping. So we're going to have a leader that we can be confident will never emerge in favor of glasnost and perestroika. And he will be so strong that we don't have to worry about it.
so how important is the development of a robust civil society, if that's even possible in China with the surveillance state put in place by Xi Jinping to the process of democratization in China? Despite the state efforts to control information and suppress dissent, are there any signs of grassroots movement or alternative forms of civic engagement that could eventually lead to political reform?
Again, a lot of the theories of democratization that were developed uh, in the 80s following the changes in South Korea, Taiwan, and Asia, and then certainly uh, Eastern Europe at the time of the fall of the wall, are based on the idea of development of a civil society. And we all recognize that, and so did China and its security apparatus, um, which has taken great steps to prevent uh, any government affiliated organizations from emerging with any kind of strength at all. This is now we're talking people to people. The second part of this is online, where they have developed the surveillance tools to make sure
Yeah.
that there will not be any online organized opposition to the regime. So they have developed the 21st century surveillance apparatus to prevent the emergence of civil society. Having said that, I would note one thing that um, there are still efforts out there by people in China to do this, sometimes with great impact. So China's COVID policies turned around after a bunch of kids in Shanghai started turning out on the streets to protest. And of course, that was merely the symbolic act for the fact that people across China were really unhappy. So I can't rule out I can't say that acts of civil disobedience, or maybe we can call it civil, evident civil unhappiness. Uh, I can't say that they don't exist, and that they, I, I think they do and can have an impact.
Okay. And what about the intellectuals and Chinese scholars that come to the United States and understand the nature of democracy, which is very, very different than the Chinese narrative of America in decline and how Chinese socialism is on the rise and America is a declining hegemon and their system is better in technological development and they're going to have the world's largest economy and so on. Do you think those people who get a taste of what it's like in America are going to come back to China and somehow facilitate some type of change, or they're the future leaders of tomorrow, or going to work in important positions within the government or in the private sector, may have a different understanding and look for and have an impact on political liberalization?
The problem on that is that the Chinese sky that the spirit of nationalism seems to be so strong, including among Chinese intellectuals, um, that I think they arrive and decide, they still believe in the superiority of the Chinese system. Uh, and so I'm not sure that, and particularly with our particularly messy democracy of the current era, I'm not sure that they're bringing back some message of positive feelings towards American democracy. Now, let me just a little bit of history on this, um, of what a tremendous change this is. I can remember because I was covering not from Beijing, but from Washington, the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square protests. And in those months afterwards, Chinese nationalism, uh, as it was opposed to the party. I mean, you had this tremendous outpouring of feeling China is a great country and this what's just happened is tragic. Um, I believe this is both in China and certainly among Chinese students in the United States, to the extent that Chinese students for those 6 months or 8 months lobbied Congress to give them protection from having to return to China. And ironically, the argument at the time by the most uh, those who favored good relationship and maintaining good relationships with the regime, the argument was we want these students to go back to China because they will be agents for democracy and change, having seen what's going on at American universities and in the United States. And it really only took about 2 or 3 years for, in my sense of it, for um, Chinese nationalism to begin to work the other way. And that's when it took only about 2 or 3 years to get patriotic student organizations in the United States and so on. So, really the sense of Chinese nationalism is such that I just don't see anytime soon Chinese returned intellectuals and students as an agent for change in democracy in China.
Okay. I got the 10-minute warning. I know they only allow for 40 minutes on
Mhm.
Zoom. So I guess if we get cut off,
Yeah.
just recopy or repaste the link into Zoom and we'll resume the last 20
Okay.
minutes again. So I know I don't know how much time is left, maybe 5 minutes. So if we
Okay.
get cut off, we'll just,
Yeah.
if that doesn't work for any reason, I'll send out another Zoom meeting within the
Good.
next 5 minutes with a new link, but it should work.
Yeah, not a problem. Yeah.
So, what responsibilities do you think Western democracies have when it comes to advocating for democratic values in China?
I think very strong responsibility. Governments have um, uh, ha each individual government has some kind of voice, often greater than any individual voice. And I think that they need to speak up for democracy, to speak up for those who are imprisoned in
Xinjiang.
China,
Yeah,
Xinjiang and elsewhere.
yeah,
It's
Tibet.
funny. I hate to sound like an old guy here, but the power of the Xinjiang cause, extremely valid, justified, and important as it is, has somehow dwarfed out for the moment is blanking out what's happening in Tibet,
Yeah, yeah.
which used to have greater there was greater awareness of Tibet and little awareness of Xinjiang in the United States for years. Either way, and I would of course include Hong Kong on this.
Mhm.
Um, I just think that it's in the interest of European Asian democracies to speak out on behalf of uh, of freedom of speech, the right to dissent, the right to oppose.
Now, should the United States and Western countries sanction China for violations of human rights, or is just speaking out against it enough?
I think that in particular cases there's an argument for sanctions. Yes, I've always felt that.
Mhm. Yeah, I know the Biden administration was big on that too, sanctioning, particularly in Xinjiang, any products that were made in Xinjiang by those who oppressed uh,
Right,
the Muslims in that region. They were no longer allowed to
right.
export their products to the United States. So those individuals responsible were banned for entering the United States. Their visas were denied, and they were sanctioned, and so on. So maybe that is a strategy that we should continue and uphold. Maybe the Trump administration ought to do that, but we'll see in time. Um, Both countries exhibit strong forms of nationalism. Chinese nationalism under the banner of the Chinese dream, and US exceptionalism based on the idea of promoting democracy worldwide. How do these national ideologies shape their global strategies and relations with other countries?
I could answer that in writing. I haven't really thought about that.
Okay.
Um, Wait, the question is how nationalism shapes.
It basically shapes their global strategies and relationship with each other. One advocates American exceptionalism, the idea of promoting democracy worldwide, and the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, reunifying with Taiwan, um, gaining the territory it claims to in the South China Sea, and so on, and people living a luxurious life, increasing the quality of life of the Chinese people.
I mean, I could answer that in writing or something. I don't have an immediate answer on that.
Okay, no problem. Um, how do you think the ideological differences between the United States and China affect their positions on trade, climate change, and global health?
Well, same. I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Okay, no, I understand. I understand. What about looking ahead? How do you see the ideological divide between the U.S. and China affecting their global influence over the next 20 years?
Well, at the moment, ideology is gaining ever more importance on within the on the world stage in the sense that um, there's